So next, let's create our Express application. I'm going to touch a file. I'm going to call it server.js, and this is where my Express server is going to end up living. I'm going to do that. I'm going to go back to my editor. Again, I could go and I could look at the documentation here. Sometimes people just do a copy and paste, but it's easy enough to set this up. So I'm going to basically duplicate what's over here. The important things are that if I'm going to be using Express, I need to bring in Express and I need to require Express. Now if I go over here and I just run nodemon, I've got that installed globally, server.js, it'll end up running. And let me just point something out to you. If I was to go over here and I was to remove my node modules folder, because that's where it's finding Express, if I were to remove this folder and go back here and I'm going to run this again, it's going to tell me, hey, look, I can't find Express. But again, never really worry about doing that because, again, you could always end up getting that back by just doing npmi and you'll end up getting Express back. So the reason I bring that up is that it's important to realize that Node is actually, this process is getting Express. Let me actually do this the way I had it before, nodemon server.js. It's getting Express from your node modules folder. So what we're going to do here is that we're going to create an app. So Express ends up exporting a module. When we require Express, one of the things we get is a function, and if we call that function, we'll end up getting an app. And what we're going to do is we're going to have this app listen, and we'll have it listen on port 3000, and there's a callback that you could send here, so it's pretty common to go over here and do console.log listening on port 3000. You could do different ports as well. We're going to start off with this. Now, once I end up doing that, what's going to happen is I'm going to have a server that's running on port 3000. And again, this is not that different than what we ended up doing with our server when we ended up using our HTTP module. If you remember, it was something along the lines of HTTP equals require HTTP, and then we went over here and we said server equals HTTP, create server. And it was similar to what we ended up doing here. We had to put a callback here, and we had to end up listening. And in fact, Express is actually wrapping around HTTP. And as long as this is running, what I could do is I could go over here to localhost 3000, and instead of spinning around here, Express says, hey, look, by default, I'm going to try to handle your request. If you don't give me a route to handle this, there's really nothing I can do here. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, one of the things you see in the documentation is that you could basically establish a slash route. And if you remember, if we had to do this with create server, we had to do all this work. Express is utilizing that single callback, but it's actually directing things to the right route. And so if we go over here and we say, hey, look, we want to end up handling this route, and I end up putting this callback function in here, something very different is going to happen. When I go back over here, instead of getting this error, I'm going to be back to spinning forever. So one of the things that I end up getting with Express is Express gets past a request or response. There's one other thing that Express ends up getting, excuse me, I should rephrase this. There's one of the things that Express will end up passing us, right? We don't call this function. This function is being called for us. And we'll cover what next does a little bit later on, but there are 3 parameters that end up getting passed here. So one of the things that we can do, we're basically registering a route with Express. Again, Express is wrapping around the HTTP server and calling the correct callback function. But if we go over here, we could say response.send hello world. So we've saved a little bit. If you compare this with the HTTP code that we wrote before, we would have to do a write, we would have to do an end, we would listen for different paths, and now we get our proverbial hello world with Express, which is probably the most basic thing that you could end up doing here.